This is impossible! Not her!
The Harrison family believed they already knew Eleanor Brooks. To them, she was simply the woman who dusted the shelves, folded the laundry, and quietly disappeared whenever guests arrived. They assumed her life began each morning in their kitchen and ended each night through the servant's entrance. They never wondered where she went after work, who waited for her at home, or what sacrifices had shaped the gentle smile she wore every day. Long before she stepped into the Harrison mansion, Eleanor had lived a life marked by hardship. She had lost her husband unexpectedly while still in her 30s, leaving her to raise her only daughter alone. She worked wherever she could, cleaning offices during the day and caring for elderly neighbors in the evenings until she eventually accepted a full-time position with the Harrison family. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave her something she valued more than pride: stability. As the years passed, Eleanor became woven into the daily rhythm of the mansion. She remembered how Robert Harrison liked his morning coffee without ever being reminded. She knew exactly which books Ethan Harrison left unfinished, which flowers Victoria Harrison preferred in the dining room, and which homemade soup Daniel Harrison asked for whenever he caught a cold, even though he never once thanked her for making it. To Eleanor, caring for the family was never about earning praise. She believed that every act of kindness mattered, even when nobody noticed. While others measured success by wealth, she measured it by the difference she could make in someone's day. The Harrison children saw things very differently. Victoria Harrison cared deeply about appearances. Every gathering had to be flawless, every conversation carefully controlled. She often corrected Eleanor in front of guests over the smallest details, never considering how embarrassing those moments were. Daniel Harrison carried himself with the confidence that money can sometimes create. He spoke to Eleanor only when he wanted something and rarely looked her in the eye. If dinner arrived a few minutes late or his clothes weren't pressed exactly the way he expected, he blamed her without asking questions. Ethan Harrison was quieter than his brother and sister, but silence did not always mean kindness. Rather than standing up for Eleanor when she was treated unfairly, he looked away. It was easier to remain comfortable than to challenge his own family. Robert Harrison watched every one of those moments. He noticed the sharp remarks that made Eleanor lower her eyes. He noticed how she quietly cleaned up broken glass after being blamed for accidents she didn't cause. He noticed that despite every insult, she still greeted each member of the family with warmth the following morning. Something about her quiet strength stayed with him. Then one rainy evening, after everyone else had gone to bed, Robert happened to glance through the library window. He expected to see Eleanor leaving for home as usual. Instead, he watched her walk slowly down the long driveway before stopping at the front gate. A car was waiting. It wasn't a taxi. It wasn't a family member. Robert hesitated for only a moment before picking up his keys. Without telling anyone where he was going, he followed Eleanor Brooks into the night, unaware that what he was about to discover would remain one of the most closely guarded secrets of his entire life. Robert Harrison kept a careful distance as he followed the aging sedan through quiet streets and into a modest neighborhood far removed from the luxury of his own estate. He expected almost anything. Over the years, he had heard enough stories about trusted employees taking advantage of wealthy families that he couldn't completely dismiss the possibility. Yet something about Eleanor Brooks had never matched those stories. She had never asked for a raise beyond what was fair. She had never borrowed money. She had never taken so much as a day off without apologizing. The car finally stopped outside a small brick house that had clearly seen better days. The roof showed signs of wear. The front porch leaned slightly to one side, and the paint around the windows had faded after years beneath the sun. Eleanor stepped out carrying 2 grocery bags before making her way to the front door. Robert remained inside his car, watching quietly. A little boy, no older than 10, rushed outside with the help of a metal walker. His face lit up the moment he saw Eleanor. She placed the grocery bags on the porch and wrapped him in the warmest embrace Robert had witnessed in years. The child laughed as though every hardship in his young life had disappeared for a brief moment. Robert felt something shift inside him. A few minutes later, an elderly neighbor arrived carrying a casserole dish. Eleanor thanked her warmly before inviting her inside. Soon another neighbor appeared, this time asking Eleanor if she could check on his wife, who had recently returned home from the hospital. Without hesitation, Eleanor walked across the street, still wearing the same work shoes she had been standing in since before sunrise. She wasn't simply going home. She was taking care of an entire community. Over the next several weeks, Robert quietly returned more than once. Each visit revealed another piece of the woman his family barely acknowledged. He watched Eleanor read to children at the local library on Saturday mornings. He saw her deliver homemade meals to elderly widows who had no relatives nearby. He noticed that whenever someone tried to thank her with money, she politely refused and simply asked them to help someone else when they had the chance. Then came the discovery that left him speechless. One afternoon, Eleanor walked into a children's rehabilitation center carrying a backpack filled with books and small toys. Robert followed at a respectful distance until he reached the reception desk. The nurse smiled as she recognized Eleanor. "She's here to see Noah again," the nurse said. "He waits for her every week." Robert glanced toward the hallway. The same little boy he had seen outside the small brick house was sitting in a wheelchair during physical therapy. Every movement looked painful, yet the moment he spotted Eleanor, his face brightened with unmistakable joy. Robert quietly asked the nurse who the boy was. Her answer changed everything. "That's her grandson. His parents passed away several years ago. She's been raising him by herself ever since." Robert stood frozen. He suddenly understood why Eleanor arrived at work before dawn and stayed long after everyone else had gone to bed. He understood why she never spent money on herself, why her shoes were worn, and why she politely declined every invitation to take time off. Every extra hour she worked helped pay for Noah's treatments. Then the nurse mentioned something else. His next surgery had been postponed. The family simply couldn't afford it. As Robert looked through the therapy room window, he watched Eleanor kneel beside Noah, gently encouraging him not to lose hope. She smiled for his sake, but when Noah turned away for a moment, Robert caught the sadness in her eyes. It was the first time he had ever seen Eleanor Brooks look as though she was carrying a burden too heavy to bear. Without introducing himself or speaking to Eleanor, Robert quietly walked back to his car. Before the sun set that evening, he made a decision that would remain a secret between him, his attorney, and one trusted friend for the rest of his life. The following morning, Robert Harrison arrived at his office earlier than usual. Instead of reviewing business reports, he asked his attorney to come in before anyone else. When the attorney arrived, Robert closed the door, placed a folder on the desk, and spoke with a seriousness that left no room for questions. "I want every one of Noah Brooks's medical bills paid," he said quietly. "Past, present, and future." The attorney looked surprised. "Should I let Mrs. Brooks know where the money is coming from?" Robert slowly shook his head. "No. If Eleanor finds out, she'll refuse every dollar." Make sure every payment appears anonymous. Within days, the rehabilitation center received the first payment. Noah's postponed surgery was immediately placed back on the schedule. Doctors who had worried about delaying his treatment suddenly had everything they needed to move forward. Eleanor stood at the billing office in complete disbelief when she was told an anonymous donor had covered every outstanding balance. She asked the receptionist the same question 3 different times. "Are you certain there's no mistake?" Each time, the answer was the same. "There is no mistake. Someone wants your grandson to receive the best care possible." Eleanor searched for answers, but none ever came. She thanked God in quiet prayer, believing that somewhere there was a stranger with a generous heart. She never imagined that stranger sat across from her almost every morning at the Harrison breakfast table. Life inside the mansion continued as though nothing had changed. Victoria Harrison remained focused on charity galas where photographers captured every smile. Daniel Harrison continued talking about expanding the family's investments while rarely speaking to the employees who kept the household running. Ethan Harrison buried himself in work, convincing himself that success would eventually bring happiness. Only Robert carried the weight of a secret that grew larger with every passing month. He found himself watching Eleanor differently. Every time she comforted another employee who was having a difficult day, every time she quietly repaired something before anyone noticed it was broken, every time she chose kindness over resentment, Robert became more certain that character could never be measured by a person's bank account. Then another moment confirmed everything he already believed. One evening, after a formal dinner attended by business partners, Daniel accidentally knocked an expensive crystal vase from its stand. The vase shattered across the marble floor. Before anyone could speak, Victoria pointed directly at Eleanor. "You should have moved it before our guests arrived." Eleanor opened her mouth to explain that she had followed the decorator's instructions, but before she could finish, Daniel interrupted. "Just clean it up." Without arguing, Eleanor quietly knelt on the floor and began gathering the broken pieces. Robert watched in silence for several seconds. Then, for the first time in years, he spoke with a firmness that caught everyone off guard. "She didn't break the vase." The room fell silent. Daniel attempted to explain, but Robert raised his hand. "I saw exactly what happened." No one said another word. Eleanor simply continued picking up the shattered glass, almost embarrassed that someone had defended her. That night, Robert remained awake long after everyone else had gone to bed. Sitting alone in his study, he opened a leather journal and began writing words his children would one day read. "If wealth has taught my children anything," he wrote, "it has hidden the value of humility. The person they consider least important has shown more dignity than all of us combined." He closed the journal and locked it inside his desk. Months passed, and Noah's health steadily improved. His surgery was successful, his physical therapy became easier, and for the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that better days were ahead. Then, without warning, everything changed. During an important board meeting, Robert Harrison suddenly stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. The papers slipped from his hands. He reached for the edge of the conference table, but his legs gave way beneath him. Within seconds, the most powerful man in the room was lying unconscious on the floor. The ambulance arrived quickly, but as the doors closed and the sirens faded into the distance, no one knew whether Robert Harrison would ever speak another word. The news spread through the Harrison family within minutes. Phone calls interrupted meetings, vacations were cut short, and every member of the family rushed to the hospital. Reporters soon gathered outside the entrance after learning that one of the city's most respected businessmen had suffered a major stroke. Inside the intensive care unit, doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize Robert Harrison while his family waited for answers that seemed to take forever. Victoria Harrison immediately began calling specialists from across the country. Daniel Harrison contacted business executives to reassure them the company would continue operating without interruption. Ethan Harrison stood quietly near the waiting room window, staring into the parking lot as though hoping the uncertainty would somehow disappear. Then Eleanor Brooks arrived. She had left the mansion exactly as it was, still wearing her work clothes. Her eyes were filled with concern, but she stayed near the back of the waiting room, believing the family deserved their privacy. She never intended to make herself part of such a deeply personal moment. A nurse stepped into the hallway. Only immediate family can visit for now. Eleanor quietly nodded before anyone else could speak. I understand. She turned to leave. Before she reached the elevator, another nurse hurried after her. Mrs. Brooks. Eleanor stopped. The patient regained consciousness for just a few seconds. She waited patiently. He spoke only one name. Eleanor looked confused. The nurse smiled gently. He asked for you. The hallway became completely silent. Victoria looked toward the nurse in disbelief. There must be some mistake. The nurse checked the chart once more. There wasn't. Mr. Harrison clearly asked if Eleanor Brooks was here. Daniel frowned. Our father has 3 children. The nurse answered with quiet professionalism. And yet he asked for Mrs. Brooks. A few minutes later, Eleanor entered Robert's hospital room. Machines softly echoed through the room as Robert slowly opened his eyes. Speaking was difficult, but when he saw Eleanor standing beside his bed, a faint smile appeared across his face. You came, he whispered. Eleanor gently nodded. Of course I came, Mr. Harrison. He reached for her hand with what little strength he had left. Thank you. She looked puzzled. You don't have to thank me. Yes, Robert whispered. I do. Tears formed in Eleanor's eyes, though she still had no idea why. Outside the room, the Harrison children watched through the small glass window in the door. None of them could understand what they were seeing. Their father appeared more peaceful with Eleanor standing beside him than he had been with anyone else since arriving at the hospital. As the days passed, Robert's condition remained uncertain. Some mornings brought signs of improvement. Other days brought setbacks that left doctors concerned. Throughout it all, Eleanor came every evening after finishing her work at the mansion. She read passages from Robert's favorite books, adjusted his blankets, and quietly prayed beside his bed whenever she thought no one was watching. One afternoon, a young nurse approached another member of the hospital staff while watching Eleanor sit beside Robert. Is she his sister? She asked softly. The older nurse smiled. No. His daughter? Again, the answer was no. Then who is she? The older nurse glanced toward Eleanor before quietly replying. She's the family's maid. The younger nurse looked back through the window, unable to hide her surprise. I've worked here for 12 years, she said. Very few people stay this faithfully beside someone who isn't family. Without realizing it, she had spoken a truth that would soon force the Harrison family to confront something they had ignored for more than 20 years. While Eleanor spent her evenings at the hospital, something entirely different was happening back at the Harrison estate. Daniel had begun searching Robert's private office. Victoria was checking filing cabinets. Ethan was opening storage rooms that had remained locked for years. They told themselves they were looking for business records that might help protect the company. But deep down, Each of them was searching for the same thing: their father's final will. None of them noticed the old brass key resting inside Robert Harrison's desk drawer. And none of them knew that the key opened a room containing secrets their father had protected for decades. Late that evening, after returning from the hospital, Daniel Harrison unlocked the front door of the mansion and headed straight for his father's private study. Victoria and Ethan were already waiting. The house was unusually quiet, and for the first time in years, Robert Harrison's chair sat empty. The silence made the room feel unfamiliar, as though the man who had built everything around them had taken its heart with him. Daniel opened drawer after drawer, carefully sorting through business contracts, investment reports, and handwritten notes. Victoria searched the shelves behind the large mahogany desk, convinced their father had hidden important documents somewhere no one would think to look. Ethan remained near the fireplace, studying the room with growing curiosity. "There has to be another safe," Daniel said. "Our father planned everything," Victoria replied. "He wouldn't leave something this important out in the open." As they searched, Ethan noticed a small brass key tucked beneath an old leather journal. It wasn't labeled, and none of them had ever seen it before. "Did either of you know about this?" he asked. Daniel shook his head. Victoria took the key and examined it. "It has to open something." For the next several minutes, they tried nearly every cabinet and drawer in the study without success. Just as they were about to give up, Ethan's attention settled on a large bookcase that stretched from floor to ceiling. One section looked slightly newer than the rest, as though it had been repaired years earlier. Daniel pushed against it. Nothing happened. Victoria inserted the brass key into a nearly invisible keyhole hidden within the wooden frame. A soft click echoed through the room. Slowly, the bookcase shifted inward. Behind it was a small private room none of them knew existed. The air inside carried the scent of old paper and cedar wood. A single desk sat beneath a reading lamp. Along one wall were shelves filled with neatly organized journals, photo albums, and carefully labeled boxes. Everything had been preserved with remarkable care, as though Robert had intended someone to find it one day. Daniel stepped inside first. "What is all this?" Victoria opened one of the boxes. Inside were hundreds of receipts, medical payments, prescription invoices, rehabilitation expenses. Every one of them carried the same family name: Brooks, Eleanor Brooks. Daniel's face hardened. "So that's it." Victoria looked up. "What do you mean?" He was giving her money. Ethan picked up another folder. "This isn't just money." Inside were canceled checks made payable directly to hospitals, therapy centers, and children's specialists. None of them had Eleanor's signature. None had been deposited into her personal account. Daniel wasn't convinced. Maybe she convinced Dad to do all this. Victoria nodded. She had access to him every day. She could have influenced him for years. Then Ethan reached for an old photograph resting inside a leather album. It showed Robert Harrison sitting beside a young boy in a wheelchair. Standing beside them was Eleanor. All three were smiling. "I've never seen this before," Ethan whispered. Another photograph showed Robert attending what appeared to be the boy's graduation from a rehabilitation program. Another captured Robert applauding as the child took several careful steps without assistance. None of the Harrison children had been present for any of those moments. Victoria continued searching until she discovered a bundle of handwritten letters tied together with a blue ribbon. Every envelope had been addressed to Robert Harrison. None had ever been mailed. She unfolded the first letter. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor. It wasn't a request for money. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a simple thank you letter addressed to an unknown person who had anonymously paid for Noah's medical treatments. Eleanor wrote that she prayed every day for the stranger who had given her grandson another chance at life. She admitted she had searched for years to discover who that person was, but had never found the answer. Daniel slowly lowered his head. If she wrote these, Ethan finished the sentence. Then she never knew. Before anyone could say another word, Victoria noticed a small video recorder sitting neatly on the desk. A handwritten note rested beneath it. It read only 7 words. Play this only when I'm gone. Daniel Harrison picked up the folder with unsteady hands. For the first time since their father had been admitted to the hospital, his confidence had disappeared. Victoria no longer seemed interested in defending herself, and Ethan remained seated, staring at the blank television screen where Robert's face had vanished only moments earlier. Inside the folder was a single letter. It was addressed to all 3 of them. Daniel unfolded the pages and began reading aloud. My dear Victoria, Daniel, and Ethan, if you have reached this point, then you already know Eleanor Brooks never deceived me. She never manipulated me. She never asked me for a single favor. I know some of you may still struggle to believe that. That is why I have arranged for every financial record to be reviewed by an independent investigator before my will is carried out. The room fell silent once again. Attached to the letter was the name of a respected forensic accounting firm Robert had hired months before his illness. He had anticipated every question his children might ask. He knew they would suspect Eleanor, and he wanted the truth established beyond any doubt. 3 days later, while Robert remained in critical condition, the investigators arrived at the Harrison estate. They spent hours reviewing bank statements, tax records, hospital invoices, charitable donations, and years of financial transactions. Nothing was overlooked. Every payment connected to Eleanor Brooks was examined from beginning to end. Daniel followed them from room to room, convinced they would eventually uncover something that explained why his father had placed so much trust in a housekeeper. Victoria remained certain there had to be hidden transfers or expensive gifts that Eleanor had somehow concealed. Ethan said very little. Deep inside, he was beginning to fear that his father had been right about all of them. Nearly a week later, the lead investigator returned with a thick report. The 3 siblings gathered in the same living room where the attorney had first announced that everything would begin with Eleanor Brooks. The investigator placed the report on the coffee table. I've completed a full review of Mr. Harrison's financial records. Daniel leaned forward, and the investigator looked directly at him. There is no evidence that Eleanor Brooks ever requested money, accepted unauthorized gifts, altered legal documents, or influenced your father's financial decisions. Daniel frowned. What about the hospital payments? They were authorized personally by Robert Harrison. The scholarships? Also Robert Harrison. The donations? Robert Harrison. The trust accounts? Robert Harrison. Victoria crossed her arms. So you're telling us she received all this help and never knew? The investigator slowly nodded. That is exactly what the evidence shows. He opened another section of the report. In fact, there is something else you should know. All 3 looked at him. On 4 separate occasions, Eleanor attempted to return money she believed had been deposited into her account by mistake. Daniel looked confused. What happened? The bank contacted Mr. Harrison. Rather than allowing the money to remain, he instructed us to remove it immediately. Victoria frowned. Why? The investigator smiled faintly. Because he knew Eleanor would never keep anything she hadn't earned. No one spoke. The investigator continued. There was another incident 2 years ago. He removed a copy of a security report from the file. A jewelry box containing a diamond necklace valued at nearly $80,000 disappeared after one of your family's holiday parties. Victoria immediately remembered the necklace. I thought it had been stolen. It wasn't. The investigator handed her a photograph. The cleaning staff found it beneath a sofa cushion after the guests had left. Victoria studied the image. Eleanor found it. Yes. Daniel asked the obvious question. Why didn't she say anything? The investigator answered without hesitation. She walked directly to Mr. Harrison's office, placed the necklace on his desk, and told him she hoped whoever lost it wouldn't spend the night worrying. Victoria closed her eyes. She remembered accusing every member of the household staff that evening. Several employees had cried during questioning. One had resigned the following week. Eleanor had never defended herself. She had simply continued working the next morning as though nothing had happened. The investigator closed the report. I've worked financial fraud cases for over 25 years. I usually uncover greed, deception, or hidden motives. He looked around the room. This is the first investigation I've ever completed where the person under suspicion turned out to be exactly who everyone hoped they were. After he left, the Harrison mansion became unusually quiet. No one argued. No one blamed Eleanor. No one even knew what to say. Then the telephone rang. It was the hospital. Robert Harrison had regained consciousness, and he was asking to see his attorney immediately. None of them realized that Robert had only enough strength left for one final meeting. The last pages of his will were about to be read exactly as he had written them, and the decision waiting inside would leave the Harrison family speechless. Daniel Harrison picked up the video recorder with hesitant hands. For a moment, no one spoke. The room felt smaller than before, as though the walls themselves were waiting to hear Robert Harrison's final words. Ethan connected the recorder to the television mounted on the study wall, while Victoria unfolded the handwritten note once more, hoping there was something they had missed. The screen flickered to life. Robert Harrison appeared seated behind the same desk where his children now stood. He looked healthy, calm, and completely aware that one day they would be watching him. "If you're seeing this," he began, "it means my time has come, and there are truths I can no longer leave unsaid." The three siblings stood in silence. "I know what you're thinking," Robert continued. "You're wondering why this room exists and why so many of the records inside it involve Eleanor Brooks." Daniel folded his arms. Victoria stared at the screen without blinking. Ethan quietly took a seat. Robert smiled gently before continuing. "The answer is much simpler than you imagine." He paused for several seconds. "Eleanor never asked me for anything." The room became still. Not once in 23 years did she ask for money, favors, promotions, gifts, or special treatment. Every decision I made was mine alone. Daniel looked toward Victoria, who no longer seemed as certain as she had only moments earlier. Robert reached into a folder beside him and removed a sheet of paper. "I wrote down every time my children believed they were teaching Eleanor about her place in this house." He lowered the page. What they never realized was that she was teaching all of us about character. Robert's voice grew softer. "The first lesson came 15 years ago." The video faded into an older recording captured by a home security camera. It showed a young housekeeper carrying a tray of food through the kitchen. Daniel, much younger then, accidentally knocked an expensive serving dish onto the floor. It shattered into dozens of pieces. Before anyone could react, Eleanor stepped forward. "I dropped it," she told the house manager. Daniel watched the recording with disbelief. Robert's voice returned. She protected you because she knew your temper would cost you opportunities if you never learned responsibility. Another recording appeared. This one showed Victoria preparing for an important charity fundraiser. Just hours before the event, she discovered that an envelope containing thousands of dollars in donations had disappeared. She immediately blamed Eleanor. The police were almost called. 2 hours later, the envelope was found inside Victoria's own handbag. No apology was ever offered. Robert looked directly into the camera. Eleanor accepted the accusation without defending herself because she refused to embarrass my daughter in front of her guests. Victoria covered her mouth. The memory returned with painful clarity. She had convinced herself Eleanor had simply forgotten about the incident. Instead, Eleanor had silently carried the humiliation for years. Another video began. This time it showed Ethan during his first year after college. He had returned home discouraged after making a costly mistake at work. Believing no one understood his disappointment, he spent hours alone in the garden. A few moments later, Eleanor quietly walked outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. The security camera captured them talking for nearly an hour. Robert's voice returned once again. "Ethan, you once told Eleanor you felt like a failure." Ethan slowly nodded as tears filled his eyes. "You probably don't remember what she told you." The recording changed to include audio. Eleanor's gentle voice could be heard clearly. "Success isn't measured by how many times you stay standing. It's measured by how many times you choose to stand again after you've fallen." Ethan lowered his head. "I remembered the advice," he whispered. "I just forgot who gave it." Robert smiled sadly from the screen. "My children spent years believing they were the ones changing Eleanor's life." He leaned closer to the camera. "The truth is exactly the opposite." He opened another folder filled with photographs. "You know about Noah because I wanted you to know. What you don't know is that Eleanor's kindness reached far beyond her own family." The screen filled with photographs they had never seen before. Eleanor delivering meals to veterans who lived alone. Reading stories to children at the public library every Saturday morning. Visiting nursing homes during holidays so elderly residents would not spend Christmas without company. Buying winter coats for children using money she earned from working overtime. Helping a former employee who had lost everything in a house fire. Every photograph carried a date. Every act had happened quietly, without recognition, without publicity, without asking anyone to notice. Robert looked into the camera one final time before the recording ended. "If you still believe Eleanor Brooks became important because of what I gave her, then you've misunderstood everything." He smiled gently. "I trusted Eleanor because of what she gave everyone else." The screen suddenly went black. No one in the room moved. The silence that followed was heavier than anything Robert Harrison had said. Then Daniel quietly reached for another folder lying beside the television. Across the front, in his father's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words that would change everything once again. "The final instructions before my will is read." By the time the Harrison family arrived at the hospital, Robert Harrison had been moved to a private room. His condition had improved just enough for him to speak in short sentences, but every word demanded effort. The doctors made it clear that he needed complete rest, yet Robert insisted there was one final matter that could not wait another day. His attorney arrived carrying a sealed leather portfolio. Eleanor Brooks stood quietly near the doorway, prepared to leave the moment she believed the discussion had become too personal. Robert slowly turned his head toward her. "Eleanor." She stepped closer. "Yes, Mr. Harrison. Please stay." She hesitated. "I don't think I should." "You should." Those 2 words settled the matter. The attorney opened the portfolio and placed several documents on the small table beside Robert's bed. "My instructions remain exactly as written?" he asked. Robert nodded. "Exactly." The attorney looked around the room before speaking. "Mr. Harrison asked me to witness one final conversation before his will is formally presented." Robert gathered his strength. "For years, I've built businesses." He paused to catch his breath. "I believed success was measured by numbers." His eyes slowly turned toward his children. "I was wrong." No one interrupted. "The greatest investment I ever made wasn't in real estate, or the stock market, or the company." He looked at Eleanor. "It was believing in people." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. "I don't deserve this, Mr. Harrison." Robert smiled gently. "That's exactly why you do." Victoria quietly lowered her head. Daniel stared at the floor. Ethan could no longer hide the regret on his face. Robert reached beneath his blanket and handed a small brass key to his attorney. "There is one last box." The attorney accepted it. "It will be opened after." Robert smiled softly. "You know when." The attorney nodded without another word. A few minutes later, Robert closed his eyes to rest. The doctors asked everyone to leave so he could recover. Eleanor was the last person to step into the hallway. Before the door closed, Robert quietly called her name one final time. She turned around. "Thank you for reminding me what a good life looks like." Unable to hold back her tears, Eleanor simply smiled. "No, Mr. Harrison." He looked at her. "You reminded all of us." The following morning, the phone rang just before sunrise. Robert Harrison had passed away peacefully in his sleep. His funeral drew hundreds of people: business leaders, former employees, neighbors, teachers, doctors, veterans, families whose lives had been changed through anonymous acts of generosity. Many spoke about Robert's success, but far more spoke about his kindness. As the service came to an end, the attorney quietly approached the Harrison children. "It is time." 2 days later, everyone gathered once again inside the Harrison mansion. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. No one argued over money. No one whispered about Eleanor. The attorney placed Robert's final will on the table. "I will now read the remaining instructions exactly as Mr. Harrison wrote them." He broke the final seal. "To my beloved children, I leave you the family home, the company, and every asset I spent my life building. But there is one condition that cannot be changed, challenged, or ignored." Daniel looked up. Victoria held her breath. Ethan leaned forward. The attorney continued. "Before any inheritance is released, Eleanor Brooks must accept the position of chairwoman of the Harrison Family Foundation. Every charitable gift, every scholarship, every community project, and every dollar dedicated to helping others will require her final approval." The room fell silent. The attorney continued reading. "If Eleanor declines, or if any member of my family attempts to remove her from that position, every dollar assigned to my children will instead be donated to hospitals, children's rehabilitation centers, veterans organizations, and homeless shelters across this country." Daniel stared in disbelief. Victoria blinked away tears. Ethan slowly smiled. For the first time, they understood. Their father had never been trying to reward Eleanor Brooks with power. He was protecting the values that had built his legacy. The attorney closed the document. Then he looked toward Eleanor. "Mrs. Brooks." She looked up nervously. "Mr. Harrison left one final letter." He handed her a sealed envelope. With trembling hands, Eleanor opened it. Inside was a single handwritten page. "My dear Eleanor, if you are reading this, then you are probably wondering why I trusted you with something so important. The answer is simple. Money can build buildings. Success can build companies. But only compassion can build a family. For 23 years, you cared for my house. Without realizing it, you were also caring for my heart. Thank you for showing me the kind of wealth that cannot be counted. My greatest blessing was never what I earned. It was meeting you. By the time Eleanor finished reading, there was hardly a dry eye left in the room. The room remained silent long after Eleanor Brooks folded Robert Harrison's letter and placed it back inside the envelope. No one seemed eager to speak. The woman they had overlooked for more than 23 years was standing in the very center of the family. Yet she looked as though she wished she could quietly return to the hallway where she had spent so much of her life. The attorney gently cleared his throat. Mrs. Brooks, before we conclude today's reading, there is one final matter. Eleanor looked up. What is it? Mr. Harrison asked that I receive your answer today. She looked confused. My answer. Will you accept the position of chairwoman of the Harrison Family Foundation? Eleanor immediately shook her head. I can't. The attorney remained calm. May I ask why? She looked around the room before answering. I've spent my whole life cleaning homes, caring for families, and trying to help where I could. I've never managed an organization. There are people far more qualified than I am. Daniel quietly stood from his chair. For the first time in many years, he walked toward Eleanor without pride or impatience. My father didn't choose you because of your resume. Eleanor looked at him in surprise. He chose you because he trusted your heart. Victoria slowly approached as well. Her voice trembled. I owe you an apology. Eleanor tried to stop her. You don't have to. Yes, Victoria interrupted gently. I do. Tears filled her eyes. I judged you before I ever took the time to know you. I blamed you for mistakes you didn't make. I spoke to you in ways no one deserves to be spoken to. She lowered her head. I spent years hosting charity events so people would see me as generous. Then she looked directly at Eleanor. You were living generosity every single day without asking anyone to notice. Eleanor reached out and gently held Victoria's hands. There is nothing for me to forgive. Daniel swallowed hard before speaking. I laughed when the attorney said everything began with you. His voice broke. I was wrong. He looked around the room. The truth is, everything worth saving began with you long before any of us realized it. Ethan stepped forward last. I've carried something with me ever since we watched my father's recording. He smiled sadly. I remembered your advice in the garden. Eleanor nodded softly. I remember that afternoon. You helped me believe in myself when I couldn't. He paused. But when you needed someone to stand up for you, I stayed silent. His eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry. For several moments, no one spoke. Then Eleanor did something none of them expected. She embraced all three of them. Not because they had earned it, but because forgiveness had always come naturally to her. The attorney quietly smiled. I believe Mr. Harrison hoped this moment would happen. Eleanor wiped away a tear before looking toward him. If accepting this responsibility helps keep Robert's dream alive. She smiled gently. Then I accept. Months turned into years. Under Eleanor Brooks' leadership, the Harrison Family Foundation became known across the country for helping people who had nowhere else to turn. Scholarships opened doors for students who believed college was impossible. Children received life-saving medical care regardless of their family's income. Veterans found housing after years of living on the streets. Single mothers received support while rebuilding their lives. Food programs reached families facing difficult seasons. Community centers welcomed lonely seniors who simply needed someone to remember their names. Every major decision followed the same simple question Eleanor asked at every meeting. Who needs our help the most? The answer guided everything. Daniel gradually shifted his focus from expanding wealth to expanding opportunity. Victoria stopped organizing charity events for recognition and began spending her weekends volunteering alongside the people she once overlooked. Ethan established mentorship programs for young entrepreneurs, remembering how one conversation in a quiet garden had changed his own life. The Harrison name no longer represented only business success. It became a symbol of compassion. Several years later, the foundation celebrated the opening of a new children's rehabilitation center. Families from across the region gathered for the ceremony. Among the speakers that day was a confident young man named Noah Brooks. No longer dependent on a walker or wheelchair, he stood proudly before the audience. He smiled as he looked toward Eleanor. My grandmother spent her life teaching me that kindness is never wasted. He paused. Robert Harrison showed me that one person's compassion can change another person's future forever. The audience rose to its feet. As the applause filled the room, Eleanor quietly looked toward a portrait of Robert displayed near the entrance. She smiled through grateful tears. The promise he had made with quiet acts of generosity had become a legacy that would continue long after both of them were gone. It is often said that a family's greatest treasure is measured by the size of its inheritance. The Harrison family learned a different lesson. Their greatest treasure had never been hidden inside bank accounts, property deeds, or investment portfolios. It had quietly walked their hallways every morning, carrying a tray of breakfast, offering a kind word, and expecting nothing in return. The woman they once dismissed as just the maid became the heart of the Harrison legacy and the greatest blessing their family would ever know. What would you have done if you had been one of Robert Harrison's children? Would you have recognized Eleanor's worth before it was too late? Or would you have made the same mistake? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for another unforgettable, true inspired story about courage, sacrifice, and the extraordinary people who often go unnoticed until they change everything.